हाँ डायरेक्ट लाइव हो रहा है। ये आपको एज इट इज़ मैं लिंक शेयर कर दे रहा हूँ आपको व्हाट्सएप पे। आपको जिनको दिखाना होगा दिखा सकते हो। वैसे प्लेलिस्ट उनको बता दीजिएगा मेरा है, ठीक है।
दोनों जगह में लाइव और फिर बाद में
दोनों एक साथ कर रहा हूँ, एडिटिंग हो रहा है, ठीक है।
हरे कृष्णा। एक भजन गाएंगे, आप प्रयास कीजिए गाने का। तो कुछ प्रयास कर रहे हैं स्क्रीन में डालने के लिए, अगर स्क्रीन में आ जाते हैं तो कुछ देख सकते हैं।
No, Baja Hure Mona. And you have to describe it in English what you just said. This is an English class. We'll be singing a bhajan in relationship to what we'll be reading about Prabhupada's life today, called Baja Hure Mana by Govinda Das Kaviraj. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutle Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavari Paschatya Deshatarine. We're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita from the chapter of College, Marriage, and Gandhi's Movement. As at other British-run schools in India, all the European teachers at Scottish churches had to learn the local language. Once Professor Urquhart walked past Abai and a group of students as they were eating some peanuts and talking together. One of the students, speaking in Bengali, made a joke at Professor Urquhart's expense. To their surprise, Professor Urquhart immediately turned to the jokester and answered in Bengali, and Abai and the others felt ashamed. Now, this particular professor, Urquhart, as most of the professors, he was Scottish, a Scottish missionary. And all of the missionaries, they were instructed that they had to learn the local language wherever they were doing their preaching work. Now, this was a very, very organized arrangement. This particular college that Prabhupada was attending, the Scottish Churches College, at that time, England and Scotland had combined. And England had kicked out the Catholics. Now, the Catholics, they were connected with the Roman Church in Italy. So these missionaries, they came out of Scotland and they came all over India to protect and uplift what they considered to be pagans. A pagan religion is anything that does not accept Jesus Christ as the Savior. Because in Christianity, they believe that when God created everything, when He created man, God told man that you can do anything what you want, you can live very happily, but there's one fruit that you can't eat. And if you eat that, that will be a sin. So then God created woman from the man. And a snake living in that tree convinced the woman, Eve, to eat that fruit. And she then convinced Adam to eat that fruit. And because this is the fruit of knowledge, they say, the snake convinced Eve that if you eat this fruit, you will have the same knowledge of good and bad as God has. That's why He doesn't want you to eat it. So when they ate the fruit of knowledge, they were cursed by God to suffer. And after that, all of the troubles of humanity came. From their children, they had 2 sons. One son killed the other son. So many calamities happened after that. Then God, out of His kindness, sent His own Son, Jesus Christ. This is what the Christians teach. And Jesus Christ, if one accepts Jesus Christ, then when you die, because you only get one lifetime on earth, when you die, at the time of judgment, this is why the Christians bury their dead. They believe that the body rises up, and if they were good, they go to heaven with God, and if they were bad and sinful, they go to hell eternally. So the Scottish priests had come to teach everyone about Christianity in India, because the Indians were backward people, uncivilized. This was their concept. They didn't know anything about Jesus Christ, and therefore they had come to save the country of India. At the same time, they had come to rob India of all of their treasures, which they did very, very artfully, and to this day, the greatest treasures are still in England. of India. So this Scottish Churches was the first college that was set up in India because the British made Calcutta their capital. And this Professor Urquhart, he was a saintly man, Prabhupada said. He was actually friends with this professor, but they didn't know that he knew Bengali. So when they made a joke to him, and he turned around and answered them in Bengali, they were very ashamed, especially Prabhupada was, because he respected his teachers just like they were his father. And why were the teachers so nice? They had a purpose. They wanted to instill Christianity subversively into the teachings. So this is how they did it. Bible study was compulsory. The Bible Society had issued each student a beautifully bound Bible, and each morning everyone gathered for scripture reading, prayers, and hymns. So Prabhupada explained when he talked about this with his disciples that every single day of school, from 1 o'clock to 1:30, they had to study the Bible. It was compulsory. And there was a prayer that they would sing. And that prayer, it's because God is one. It's just like our bhajans. They're praying to God for deliverance, that for us, life is so long and miserable, but for you, our lifetime is just a flash in eternity. So you take us to your place and we can live eternally with you. So all of these prayers that they learned were coming from the Bible, particularly from what's called the Psalms of David. There are two Bibles, the Old Bible and the New Bible. The Old Bible is given by much earlier, more than 5,000 years, and the New Bible is the teachings of Jesus Christ and his disciples. So these teachings are coming from the Old Bible that they used to learn, and then every day, if for half an hour you hear something, you start to accept it. Prabhupada gave the example that when they taught him how to write English, they would tell him, you sit down and you write 10 pages of English. So that was his assignment. He had to write 10 pages of English. So after writing 10 pages, you learn how to write English. So gradually, every single day, hearing the teachings of Jesus Christ, and how inferior Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, all of the other religions, the pagan religions, because they accepted many gods or no God, and they thought that without Jesus they could attain salvation. Gradually they were able to convince students that this is a much higher philosophy, Christianity, because they heard it every day. One of the professors criticized the Vedic teachings of karma and transmigration of the soul. In a court of law, one cannot be prosecuted for a crime unless there is a witness. Similarly, he argued, although according to Hindus, the soul suffers in his present life for the misdeeds of his past life, where is the witness to these misdeeds? Abai was displeased to hear this criticism, and he knew how to refute it. But being only a student, he had remained silent. Socially, he was inferior, and a student had little scope to challenge a professor. But he knew that the professor's argument against karma was insubstantial. He knew there was a witness. Now, that's because in Christianity, they completely reject reincarnation, transmigration of the soul, and karma. Their belief is you only get one lifetime on this earth given by God, and whatever you do in this lifetime, you're judged. After you die, you're put into a grave, and you wait for the day of judgment. And if you had accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you can go to God's kingdom. If not, you go to hell. So they say that karma, The philosophy of karma is being taught by the devil, that same serpent who caused Adam and Eve to sin. Because karma means whatever good you do, you get a reaction. Whatever bad you do, you get a reaction. So this is the fruit of knowledge, the difference between good and bad. But they say, no, it's not by our own choice what's good and what's bad. It's just by the grace of Jesus Christ that you can go to God. So they have no scope of salvation by one's own deeds. It's only by surrendering to Jesus that you can go to God. So they completely refute karma, transmigration, many souls, exactly what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Bahunam Janmanam Ante, Gyanavam Mam Prabhadyante. Exactly what the Supreme Lord says. They say it's not true. They say that's coming from the devil. So this is very, very carefully. Because they were the professors, the students couldn't object. Just as many years ago, here also, the missionaries came to Vrindavan. And they set up a mission school. And in the 1970s, 1980s, it was the only English medium school. So we had to send our children there because they didn't know Hindi. And all the teachers were also Christian. So whatever they taught, the children had to accept. It was the same thing. Because although in the West, there are many, many different factions of Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Seventh-day Adventists, so many different kinds of Christians. When they came here to India, they all joined together. It didn't matter what their differences were. They all wanted to make the Indians into Christians. So these Christians, they would do the same thing here, right in Vrindavan. They would teach our children. They only observed the Christian holidays. And my daughter went there. In third grade, the teacher was writing on the board, "The cow have a tail." So after the class, my daughter went up to the teacher and said, "Teacher, it's the cow has a tail, not the cow have a tail." And the teacher smacked her. Said, "You don't tell me what's right and wrong." So this is the discipline in the schools. The teachers know what's best, and the students can't say anything. So although Prabhupada understood all about karma and life and Bahunam Janmanam Ante, he couldn't say anything because this was the trick. They give the students a good education, and at the same time, they put the Christianity into their ears. Some of the students, having come to Calcutta from small villages, viewed the big city and the presence of so many Europeans with bewilderment and timidity. But to Abai, Calcutta and the British were not alarming. And he even held a certain fondness for his Scottish teachers. Although he looked up to them with a mixture of awe, distance, and some tension, he admired their moral uprightness and their gentlemanly, courteous behavior with the boys. They seemed to him kind-hearted. Now, before Prabhupada was born, there was a mutiny here in India in the mid-1800s because practically all of the soldiers and policemen in India were Indians, but they were ruled by the British. And the British had brought some new guns, and on those guns they had put cow and pig fat on the bullets. And with those guns, you had to, with your teeth, you had to break off the tip of the bullet before you put it into the gun. So because all the soldiers were Hindus and Muslims, the Hindus, they wouldn't touch the bullets because it was cow fat, and the Muslims wouldn't touch it because it was pig fat. So all the soldiers, they revolted. And there was a big mutiny, and they tried to kick the English out of India. Then the English got smart. First of all, they brought all their guns, they brought all their own soldiers, and they stopped the mutiny. But then what they did was, because before that it was the East Indian Company, just for trade they were here to make as much money as possible from India. From cotton, from salt, from tea, from coffee, especially from opium. They had big opium farms. Now what they did was the English kicked out the East India Company, and they put the Queen in charge, Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria, she became the Empress of India. And she made a declaration to all the Indians that we give you amnesty. Whatever happened in this mutiny, we forgive you. And now we promise you, we will not take any part in your religious activities. We will just very carefully try to run your country nicely for you. So, of course, this was another trick. But particularly in Calcutta, what they did was they took a whole huge portion of Calcutta, and that was the Sahib quarters. Only the English could live there. No Indians could enter. They had beautiful roads, they had race courses, they had they had cricket clubs. All the beautiful life that they had in England, they brought here to Calcutta. But only the English could enter. No Indians could enter. The Indians were living outside. Where our temple is now, 3 Albert Road, that was where the British used to live. So when we first opened the temple, it was called the Sahib Mandir, because the British had come back to open a temple now. So, but that whole quarter, so when these young boys came from outside of Calcutta, from the villages, and saw how the British were living, they became frightened. They had never seen anything like this. But because Srila Prabhupada had contact with these foreigners in his college, he wasn't afraid of them. He actually respected them because they had very good management. He said that their principal, he was so rough that he used to fight with the students like a gunda, but he was such a good manager that everyone respected him. And there were other teachers who were also so rough that they would go, Prabhupada said, they would go 50 kilometers away just to avoid them. But all of these teachers, they were giving a good education to the boys, and therefore the boys respected them. And these boys in the village, they learned then how to respect them and how to progress in the college. The governor of Bengal, who was Scottish, once came to Scottish Churches College, visiting all the classrooms. The rooms were large, holding 150 students, but Abai had a front row seat and got a close look at the famous governor, the Marquis of Zetland. Now, the Marquis of Zetland, first of all, the word Zetland is a very old way of saying Scotland. So these were all Scottish priests, and now the governor himself, he was also Scottish. So when this governor of Bengal went back to England, at that time Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati sent one of his disciples, Bhakti Saranga Goswami. He was in charge of the Imli Tala here. He built the Imli Tala Mandir. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati sent him to London. He was very educated, very excellent disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And he opened a society in London. And the Marquis of Zetland, his name was Lord Ronaldsay, he agreed to become the president of that society. And they were speaking one day, and Lord Ronaldsay said to Bhakti Saranga Goswami, he said, "Can you make me a Brahmin?" And Maharaj said, "Yes, of course." He said, "So what do I have to do?" And then he quoted from Srimad Bhagavatam 1:17-38, when Kali asked Maharaj Parikshit, "Where can I live?" And Maharaj Parikshit said, "You can live in 4 places, where there's animal slaughter, where there's intoxication, drinking, where there's gambling, and where there's prostitution. Those 4 places Kali could live." So Maharaj explained to the Lord, he said, you have to give up drinking and all intoxication. You have to give up gambling and any unnecessary sports. You have to give up all animal products of eating. And you have to give up illicit association with women. And Lord Ranalji said, that is impossible. That's impossible. So he gave up trying to become a Brahmin. So it turns out that many, although they were all Scottish and they were all Christians, many of them had a deep appreciation for Indian culture, secretly. And Prabhupada gave the example because we know Prabhupada, he came from the Mullik family. He was associated with the Mulliks. So the Mulliks had rented out a portion of their property to an Indian gentleman. And he was vacating. So Prabhupada, along with his friend, Mr. Mullik, went to take possession of the room again, of the house. And he saw that the man had many, many books. And they noticed that he had a Bhagavad Gita. So immediately, Mr. Mullik went over and picked up the Bhagavad Gita. And the Englishman, he thought, oh no, he's taking my Bhagavad Gita. And so he stopped him. He said, this book is my heart and soul. You can take any other book, but you can't take this book. So secretly, although they came for one purpose, they actually had a great love for the Indian culture, and that was why they were here. Previously, it used to take, we've heard about the Suez Canal from when Prabhupada traveled. Suez Canal cuts Europe from Africa so that the boats could go from India to England. So before, it used to take 3 months to go from India to England. They had to go all the way around Africa. Once the Suez Canal was built, it only took 3 weeks. So then many, many more English people started to come here. And even before Prabhupada began his preaching, many Indians were coming here because they were attracted to the Vedic culture. So the British had their own community, completely separated from the Indians, and the Scottish priests, they were doing the preaching to turn the pagans into Christians. And then here, the school operated on the principle of strict social distance between Europeans and Indians. Even the Bengali faculty members, being of supposedly inferior race, had to use a faculty lounge separate from that of the European professors. Part of the college syllabus was England. It was a book called, syllabus means their curriculum. It was a book called England's Work in India by M. Ghosh, who was an Indian. The book elaborately explained how India had been primitive before the British rule. Abai's economics professor would sometimes shout at his class when he became frustrated with their slowness. Addressing them as representatives of the whole Indian nation, he would say, "You should never expect independence. You cannot rule. You can only work like asses, that's all." So he was condemning and he was insulting the Indian students so badly in the class. There was an economics class. Now, we've all heard of the word economics. Economics, the study of economics was started by a Scottish professor, and his name was Adam Smith. And he taught 3 things. That is production, consumption, and transportation. Now this is exactly our Vaishya Dharma also. They produce by growing crops and by getting milk products. They consume the products, and whatever extra they have, they trade with it to get the commodities that they need. But in the English system, it's called economics instead of the Varnashram Dharma. So his name was Mr. Kidd, if I remember. Satsvarupa Maharaj only gives half of the description that Prabhupada gives here. Because when Prabhupada was describing how this economics teacher was insulting the students because they were so slow, he said, you can only work like asses. He said more. The teacher said, professor said, and not only can you only work like asses, but if other asses are put under you, you don't know how to get them to work. You're useless. So, but Prabhupada, when the British, he said, we never expected that the British would leave India because they were ruling so nicely. Everyone was peaceful. And that was because the British had to be very careful because they already had one mutiny. And now they knew that unless they do everything first class in their management, there'll be another mutiny, which there was eventually, because they didn't follow what the Queen promised she would do. When they began trying to change the rules between the Hindus and the Muslim, the Hindus had one set of society rules and the Muslims had another. They tried to change all of that. First they stopped sati, and then what they were going to do is they were making it legal for widows to remarry. And that upset the Hindus so much. So many, many things like that. But in this time, the Indians were actually happy with the English rule. And Prabhupada, he was telling this story about his economics professor in 1969 in Boston, because Prabhupada had just set up the printing press in Boston. And all of the devotees who were going to be printing the Back to Godhead magazine, he was telling them this because Prabhupada said he noticed that when the British left and the Indians took over the management of the country, everything fell to pieces. Because the Indian concept was, well, it's our country, we can do whatever we want. So he said, now we've set up this printing press, and we're going to be printing the Back to Godhead magazine, and we have to have very good administration. We can't do whatever we want. You have to print this Back to Godhead magazine with very good management. So that was why Prabhupada told this story to the devotees, to tell them they have to have as good management as the British had, so that this printing can go on. It's very important. This is the Brihad Mridanga. So that this printing can go on very nicely. College life was demanding. No longer was Abai free to spend hours before the deities of Radha and Govinda early in the morning. That had been a boyhood luxury. When he would daily pass hours in the Malak's temple before the golden forms of Radha Govinda, watching the pujaris as they worshiped the deities with incense, flowers, lamps, musical kirtan, and opulent prasadam. As a child, he had played within the grassy compound of the temple, or watched the men cooking kachoris on the roadside, or bicycled or flown his kite with Baba Tarini. His life had always centered on his home at Harrison Road, his mother's talks, his father's worshiping Krishna. These scenes were now past. So we know that when Prabhupada was born, his uncle, maternal uncle, called him Nandu, which is short for Nandanandana. Bajahure mana Shri Nandanana, Nandanandana. So when you worship Nandanandana, what happens is, Abhaya Charanara Vindare, that you become fearless. because you've taken shelter at the lotus feet of Nanda Nandana. So Prabhupada's father, Gaur Mohan Dey, being a very great and pure Vaishnava, he named his son Abhay Charan. And later, Prabhupada's original, eternal spiritual father extended that name to Abhay Charanaravinda Das when he took Diksha. So when Gaur Mohan Dey insisted that Prabhupada learn how to play mridanga from a young age, it wasn't just for the purpose of playing the mridanga. Why do we play mridanga? So that we can accompany it to singing bhajans, the Vaishnav bhajans. Also, Srila Prabhupada, when they set up the first world headquarters of ISKCON in Los Angeles, eventually they made a sound studio so that they could record Prabhupada singing bhajans. What Prabhupada would do was, he would sing the bhajan and accompany himself on the harmonium. He's an excellent harmonium player. And then he would put on earphones and he would listen to his own singing and harmonium playing and add on the mridanga playing. So it wasn't someone else playing, one person playing kartals, no, Prabhupada did all the musicals along with his bhajan singing. That's how expert Srila Prabhupada was. So that means that along with the bhajan, along with the mridanga playing, Prabhupada was also learning these bhajans from his father, because in the Radha Govinda temple, they were doing kirtan. He would listen to the musical kirtan as he watched and took darshan of the deities for hours. But those days were gone now. And he was caught. Prabhupada, later we'll hear some bhajans by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Sharanagati, how our whole life is just wasted. And part of that life is wasted in trying to get a good education so that we can get a good career, so that we can get a good wife, so we can have a nice family life, all wasted. And Prabhupada explained that, he compared that to when he was a little child and he only wanted to play. And his father, he was very lenient, he let him play. But his mother, she had him tied up and dragged to school. Otherwise, he would have never gone to school if not for his mother. So now his mother she had gone back to Godhead when he was only 14, either 14 or 16. It's two different times are given. Now, in the material world, one thinks when one loses their mother or loved one is filled with lamentation. When Srila Prabhupada lost his mother, he thought, this is by the grace of God. Now I am free. So free in the sense that he could move on in life without his mother trying to force him into doing things he didn't want to do. But he was still caught because his father was very practical. Not only being a pure devotee, he knew that his son had to get married, he had to have a career, he had to be a practical and producing gentleman in society. So his father decided to put him into Scottish Church College because he saw that the professors were upright priests and he knew that he would get a good education there. There were two main colleges, the Presidency College, which was government, and the Scottish Church College, which was more what the priests wanted to do, teaching Christianity. So those days were over because his mother wasn't there anymore. He didn't have time to go to the Radha Govindaji temple, and now he was caught up here. Now he spent his days within the compound of Scottish Church's College. Here there was also a lawn and a garden with birds and even a small banyan tree. But instead of worship, there was study. The atmosphere at Scottish churches was academic, and even the casual conversation among the students as they gathered before the notice boards at the main entrance or passed in groups in and out of the main gates was usually about class assignments or collegiate activities. Now, Scottish Church College is still active in Calcutta. And they have a whole, you can look it up, they have a whole regimen of how you get admissions, who's qualified, what subjects you can take. Prabhupada, in his intermediate years, before he entered the bachelor's degree, you could have a major and a minor. So what did Prabhupada take? He took as his major Sanskrit, and he took as his minor Sanskrit. And he was first in his class in Sanskrit. And he also learned history at that time. But then when he entered into his bachelor's, his BA, he decided to take, because he was being practical and probably with his father's encouragement, he decided to take economics and philosophy. So during these bachelor years, Bachelors of Arts, the BA, he was learning economics. We just heard about his economics teacher. And he was learning all the different philosophies. And learning these different philosophies would help Prabhupada to be able to defeat them later. There's a book, I think it's called now Beyond Illusion and Doubt, but it used to be called Dialectic Spiritualism. And these are conversations where Prabhupada is explained the different philosophies of the different, many philosophers, beginning with Socrates, Aristotle, then coming up to the modern day Kant, and all the different philosophers. Prabhupada knew all of their philosophy, and he was able to defeat them very easily because of his good education. So we see how Krishna, although he had, by force, he didn't have time to do his worship anymore, he was being trained how to become a first-class preacher. He was expert in Sanskrit, plus he was learning all of the philosophies of the world. When Abai was not actually sitting side by side with his fellow students, sharing a classroom bench before one of the long desks that stood row after row in the lecture hall, when he was not looking attentively forward during the lecture of one of his professors, usually a reverend dressed in a European suit, speaking a Scottish brogue and pronouncing words like duty as duty. Now, we've heard before, there are many different types of English. How many of you have gone outside of India? So, and were they English-speaking countries that you went to? Yes. So each English-speaking country has a different type of English that they speak. If you go to Australia, you won't understand a word that they're saying because of their accent. If you go to America, they speak a completely different kind of English. And if you go to Scotland, you won't understand anything. And this is called, in English terms, it's called the Scottish brogue. And because Prabhupada had only Scottish teachers, that's how Prabhupada spoke English. So when Prabhupada came to America, the American disciples, they couldn't understand it. Although he was speaking, it was such a different English. It was, first of all, it was Victorian English. It was from 50 years earlier. The words had changed. And that's why nowadays, there's a big revolution even within ISKCON. That, for instance, Prabhupada will say someplace that women appreciate being raped. Well, the word rape had a different meaning 50 years, 100 years ago, 120 years ago. It just means when a man approaches a woman. So in Prabhupada's purports, he uses words as they were used in the Victorian age. So therefore, they want to change the words so that now modern day English people can English-speaking people can understand what Prabhupada was saying. So this is a big conflict, even within ISKCON, because of the different types of English. So we have to understand Prabhupada's English in context of how he was educated, what year he was born, what type of English they spoke, and we have to appreciate Prabhupada's books and the way he speaks in those terms. I remember when I first went back to America after maybe I had been here 11 years, and I saw my brother for the first time, and I'm telling him about life in India, and he's looking at me, he said, you're talking Victorian English. He couldn't understand what I was saying, because in 11 years you learn how to speak the way people speak where you live. And it's not the way Americans speak. So in this way, when we read Srila Prabhupada's books, they don't need to be changed. We simply need to appreciate the way Srila Prabhupada is speaking and understand in terms of his speaking. For instance, later we'll read about Subhash Chandra Bose. And Prabhupada says that he was rusticated from the Presidency College. Does anyone know what rusticated means? Well, you would know because you're Indian, right? But we've never heard of the word rusticated. So Satsvarup Maharaj, he changed the word to expelled because it meant that he had to leave the college. So then he came to Scottish Church College. So the point is, the education they were getting, when Prabhupada came to America, Prabhupada was pronouncing words like duty, it is our duty. He was pronouncing it the Scottish way, which is duty. When he was not actually in the classroom hearing their lectures on Western logic or chemistry or psychology, then he was at his homework assignments, sitting at a table amidst the bookshelves in the college library, reading from an open book or writing notes while the electric fans overhead rippled the pages. Or he was at home with his father, sisters, and brothers, but reading his lessons or writing a paper for the reverend in the lecture hall. He had had to abandon worshiping the Krishna deity he had demanded his father give him years before. He had retired his deities to a closed box. He put his deities to sleep. The same deities that he and Bhavatarini had worshipped together, now he took those deities and put them to sleep in a box because he just didn't have time to offer his food, to do his puja. Gaur Mahan was undisturbed that his pet son could no longer attend to all the devotional activities in his childhood. Now, one would be surprised because you would think that Gaur Mahan, being a pure devotee, he would be upset. But no, he understood that his son had to get this education. He didn't want him to be a fool. He saw that Abai was remaining pure in all his habits, that he was not adopting Western ideas or challenging his own culture, and that as a student at Scottish Churches College, he would not likely be exposed to immoral behavior. Gaur Mahan was satisfied to see Abai getting a good education to prepare for a career after graduation. He would be a responsible Vaishnava. He would soon marry and get a job. So Gaur Mahan was planning Abai's life. He wanted him to first get a good education, and Gaur Mahan specifically put him in this college. It was walking distance from their home, so Abai didn't have to go live in a hostel. And the professors were all priests. They were all Christian priests, which meant that they were unmarried. They were like our equivalent of brahmacharis. So he felt that Abai would get a good moral education from these priests. Even if they were Christian, Gaur Mahan had the broad vision to understand that these were actually brahmacharis simply teaching everyday subjects that had to be taught for a good education. One of Abai's classmates and close companions was Rupendranath Mitra. Abai and Rupen would study together and sit side by side in the assembly hall during Bible class, uttering the compulsory prayers. Rupen noticed that although Abai was a serious student, he was never enamored of Western education or ambitious for scholastic achievements. Now, when the Queen took over India, she said that Indians could also become officers. But in order to become an officer, you had to go to England and take a test. And then when you go to England means you would get contaminated by the English culture there. There was no such thing as vegetarianism or anything like that in those days. So when the Indians, the ambitious Indians, went to England, they got contaminated. Some of them even became Christians. And they would come back, and they wouldn't be called Indians anymore. They would be called English returned. England returned, right? Bilat, yes. Bilat, exactly. England returned. So, because they didn't want to even be considered Indians anymore, because they had gone to England. Now they were as good as the English. And then if they would pass the test, they will be able to become officers as well. So some Indians, small percentage, they were ambitious like this, to become Christian just for material purposes, it had nothing to do with religion. The devotees asked Prabhupada, with all this Bible studies, did anyone become a Christian? He said, no, no one became a Christian. No high-class person became a Christian. He said one or two, but not for that reason, because they would become Christians, they would get special privileges in the college that way. And so and this is what the Christians still do to this day. They aim for the poorest section of humanity. They give them medical, food, shelter, everything. And the people are so grateful that they become Christians. It has nothing to do with culture. It's an economic thing. So, yes, Prabhupada said none of them became Christians, although they all went to the church's school. So, Abai would confide in Rupen, I don't like these things. And sometimes he spoke of moving away. What are you thinking? Rupen would ask. And Abai would reveal his mind. Rupen found that Abai was always thinking about something religious, something philosophical, or devotional about God. All right, it's 7 o'clock now. We'll continue next week. Hare Krishna. Jai. Bilat fere. Bilat fere.
पेज नंबर
ये मेरे है
पेज नंबर
26 यहाँ था लेकिन ये अलग पेज नंबर है मैं अगले संडे क्लास भी दूंगा